The grafting knife had sat on the kitchen windowsill for 7 years, in the same spot where she had placed it the afternoon she emptied his coat pockets. The handle was birch, worn smooth at the grip from 15 springs of the same work, the same angle of the hand. He had scratched a year into the wood himself, 1998, with the tip of a finishing nail, the afternoon they signed the deed to the 12 acres. She remembered watching him do it at the kitchen table, the sound of the scratch, the thin curl of birch fiber that fell away. She had not asked why. She had understood that some things a person marks not because they need to remember, but because the marking is the thing. 7 years. The handle had gone darker at the grip from the oil she worked in each October when the season closed. The blade still held its edge. She kept it sharp the way he had kept it, drawing it twice against the honing stone and setting it back in the same place, catching the light from the ridge the same way every morning, the blade going briefly bright and then going still. Outside, the orchard ran down the east slope in 11 rows. Not in straight lines. He had never planted in straight lines, but in the slight curve that followed the natural drainage of the land, the way water wanted to go. He had spent the better part of 2 summers working that out, walking the slope after heavy rain, noting where the wet gathered and where it chose to move. She had thought he was making it more difficult than it needed to be. She had not said so. The property was 12 acres outside Sallow Creek, Alberta, which did not appear on most maps, and which people who had been through it remembered mainly for the grain elevator at the east end of the main road, and the particular quality of its silence in winter. The land around the town ran flat to the horizon in most directions, the sky doing what Alberta sky did, which was to make everything underneath it feel precisely located in the world, small and clear, and exactly where it was. He had found the parcel in October of 1997, before she had seen it, for she knew she wanted it. He had driven out alone on a Tuesday and come home in the evening with mud on his work boots. And the particular look he had when he had already decided something and was choosing his words. He described the slope, the drainage, the way the afternoon light came off the ridge. He said the soil ran deep on the east side and that the elevation would moderate the late frosts. He spoke for 20 minutes. He did not ask her to come and see it before he finished. They bought it in the spring. The apple trees were his project from the first season. 12 varieties, some of them common and some of them not. Heritage cultivars he had tracked through old nursery catalogs, driving to farms across Saskatchewan and into British Columbia in the years before he grafted his own science. He had learned the work from a retired orchardist south of Lethbridge, a man named Percival, who kept 300 trees on 8 acres and knew the lineage of every one of them the way some people know their own family history. Percival had the patience for teaching that cannot be acquired. It is either present or it is not, and he and her husband had spent 3 cold October days in the orchard before Percival decided he had passed on what needed passing. She had not come on that trip either. The orchard took years to produce reliably. The first full harvest came in the autumn of 2005, and she remembered it not for the apples but for him. The way he moved through the rows that morning, not quickly, the way his hand tested each piece of fruit before taking it, checking the give with the same seriousness he brought to things he had waited a long time for. She had watched from the kitchen window. She had thought, without intending to put it into words, "He is proud of this." And then she had thought, "I am proud of him." He was dead by the following March. The illness had moved the way illnesses move when they have already made their decision. Faster than the language surrounding them, faster than the appointments and consultations and paperwork. He was well in December. He was not by February. By March, she was standing in a cold room at a hospital in Lethbridge, while people said careful things to her that she already understood. She was 31 years old. She had not been ready, but she did not think readiness was something that arrived on schedule, regardless of how long you waited. His brother Gareth drove out from Edmonton for the funeral and stayed 3 days. He was not a bad man. He was the kind of man who believed that meaning well was the same as doing good, and that stating his concern loudly enough constituted generosity. On the second evening, he stood in her kitchen with a cup of tea he had not touched and looked out at the rose through the window and said that no one expected her to keep it, that there were options she should know about, that the land had value and it wasn't wrong to recognize that. She thanked him and said she needed to sleep. He nodded and went to the guest room. He left on the Sunday morning. She had not asked him to come back. She did not sell. That is the whole of it. And it does not grow more complicated than that, though several years of other people trying to make it complicated would suggest otherwise. She learned the orchard. Not managed it, not simply ran it, but learned it the way you learn a person, by paying close attention over a long time without forcing conclusions. She hired help for the heavy work in spring and for harvest in September. She walked the rows most mornings before the light was fully up. She kept records in a notebook she had found in his desk drawer, a continuation of the one he had been filling. And she wrote in the same columns he had used, because the columns made sense, and because his handwriting was already there, at the top of every page, and there was no reason to begin again. The first man came in the autumn of 2009. He was from Calgary and drove a truck that was too new for the road into Sallow Creek. He had a business card from a development company, and he held it with the ease of someone accustomed to the card doing introductory work on his behalf. He laid a figure on her kitchen table that was designed to produce a reaction before producing a conversation. She thanked him for the drive out and told him the property was not for sale. He said he understood entirely and that she should feel welcome to be in touch if things changed. She said she would. She showed him to the door and went back to the kitchen and stood at the window. The rose were still there. The knife was still on the sill. She went out and walked the south row until supper. Gareth called the following spring. He had not heard about the Calgary developer. She had not told him. He had his own reasons which emerged gradually over a long phone call. He had debts he referred to as a situation. He said that Ross had always considered the property a family asset. He said that holding on to something out of sentiment was understandable, but that responsible decisions required a different kind of thinking. He said that he believed, sincerely, that Ross would have understood the practicalities of their circumstances. She stood at the kitchen counter with the phone against her ear and looked at the grafting knife on the sill. She told Gareth she would think about it. She did not think about it. That evening she went out and walked the north row in the dark until the cold drove her back in. Gareth called twice more over the following year. Each call was shorter than the last. She answered both of them and said less each time. And eventually the calls stopped and she did not hear from him for a long time, and she found she did not need to. A provincial roads assessment came in 2012. The man who delivered it had a clipboard and the manner of someone who had sat in a great many kitchens in a great many small towns and had learned to be comfortable in all of them. There was a potential highway realignment being studied, he said. It was early stages and nothing was decided, but the corridor would pass through this general area if it moved forward. And affected landowners would have the opportunity to participate in a consultation process. She asked what that meant in plain language. He said it meant there would be compensation and that the process had been designed to be fair to everyone involved. She thanked him. He left a folder with provincial letterhead on the cover. She set it on the table next to the knife. The realignment went nowhere. She had been careful not to expect anything about it in either direction. The summer of 2014 brought a different kind of man. He was from an agricultural holdings company out of Regina, and he wore a vest over his dress shirt the way men in that industry sometimes did, as though they were perpetually between a boardroom and a field. He had done more research than the Calgary developer, knew the acreage, the cultivar mix, the approximate yield. He had information she had not shared publicly, which told her he had spoken to someone in Sallow Creek before coming to her, and she noted that without commenting on it. He was practiced at this. He knew which silences to let expand and which to compress. He said the company had a particular interest in heritage orchard properties, that traditional cultivars were seeing renewed market interest, that the land could be incorporated into a managed portfolio, ensuring its continued operation under professional stewardship. He said legacy twice. He said stewardship once. Then he said that a man who had built something like this, and he turned to the window, to the rose, would have wanted to see it grow beyond what a single person could manage over the long term. The room was quiet after he said it. She looked at him, not at the papers he had arranged on the table, at him, and she said that she did not know what her husband had wanted beyond what he had told her himself, and that what he had told her was that the orchard was theirs and that she should do with it as she saw fit. She said it without heat. That was harder than saying it with heat would have been. He adjusted his approach. He came at the problem from a different direction, carefully, for another 20 minutes. She listened to all of it. When he was finished, she told him the property was not for sale. He thanked her for her time in a voice that recorded an outcome. She closed the door behind him and went to the sink and ran the cold water and stood there for a while. Adair arrived in the spring of 2015. He had come up from the University of Alberta on some kind of field research appointment. That was evident from what he unloaded from his truck. Sample cases, a portable botanical press, a field guide so heavily used that it had been rebound with packing tape along the spine. He took a room at the bed and breakfast on the edge of Sallow Creek, the one run by a woman named Olive, who had strong opinions about breakfast and communicated them through portion size. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, unhurried, with the look of someone who spent time outdoors as a consequence of the work rather than from preference. She noticed him first at the post office. He was sending a parcel that required more help than the counter preferred to give, and he was patient about it in a way that suggested he was often patient about things that didn't strictly demand it. She did not speak to him. She collected her mail and went home. He appeared again at the end of the month, walking the road along the east edge of her property. She saw him from the orchard, moving slowly, stopping occasionally, writing in a small notebook. He looked at the ground, at the drainage channels, at the way the land ran down from the ridge. He did not look toward the trees. She went back to work. That June, she had a crack in the irrigation line on the upper north row, the kind of repair she had been stepping over for 2 weeks, while other things were more pressing. She came back from a supply run to Lethbridge on a Thursday afternoon and found it fixed. The line patched, the joint sealed properly, the short length of spare pipe trimmed and set neatly against the post. There was no note. She stood looking at it for a moment. She turned and looked at the row. She went inside. She did not ask anyone for 4 days. On the 5th morning, she was coming back from her walk and met him going the other direction, coffee in a travel mug, the small notebook in his coat pocket. She said, "The irrigation line on the north row." He said, "It was going." He kept walking. She stood on the road and watched him until he reached the bend, and then she turned and went home. In the kitchen, the grafting knife was on the windowsill where it had always been. She understood. It was not a gesture. It was not a claim. It was a thing that had needed doing, and he had done it. After that, she left the gate to the south row, unlatched on mornings she wasn't working it. He left pressed leaf samples on her table twice that summer, labeled in the same careful handwriting as his notebook. She added them to the records without comment. He did not explain leaving them. In early September, she found him in the north row, crouched beside one of the oldest trees. One Ross had brought back from a nursery in the Qu'Appelle Valley before that nursery closed, photographing the bark, the branch structure, the fruit, working through it methodically in the way of someone who believes they may have found something and does not want to be wrong by moving too quickly. She stood at the end of the row. She said, "What are you seeing?" He stood and looked at her. He said he wasn't certain yet. He asked if he could come back. She said she supposed that was fine. He came 4 more times before the season ended. The letter arrived on a Monday in early November, when the last of the leaves were down and the rose stood bare against a sky that had gone the pale gray of November for good. It came in the regular post, addressed in his small handwriting. She carried it inside and set it on the table and made tea and stood at the counter, looking at the envelope while the kettle came up. Then she picked it up and opened it standing. It was 5 pages. The first 2 were institutional. The department, the authorization, the research scope, careful language, hedged, the kind that requires a reader to sit with it before trusting their own interpretation. She read them through and moved to the third. The third page was about a tree, the oldest tree in the North Row, the one from Saskatchewan. The third page said, in the particular language because the matter required precision, that its genetic profile was consistent with a cultivar documented in 2 nursery catalogs from the 1920s and not verified as living since 1947. The variety had been considered extinct by researchers working in the field. If the identification held, which the department expected it would, the tree in her North Row was the last confirmed living specimen of its kind. She set the letter on the table. She walked to the door and opened it, and stood in the frame looking out at the bare rows. The cold came around her. She stood there until she was certain she was breathing in the ordinary way, and then she went back inside and read the third page again. The fourth and fifth pages were an offer. A formal preservation partnership, genetic material collection, research access across the full orchard, propagation rights for a heritage cultivar program. The financial terms were on the last page. She read the figure 3 times, not because she could not follow it, but because it sat so far outside the ordinary dimensions of her daily accounting that her mind needed more than one pass to place it correctly. She folded the letter. She set it beside the grafting knife on the windowsill, not in front of it, beside it, the 2 things touching at the corner. He came 2 days later. She had not called him, but perhaps the department had. He knocked at the door in the early evening and she let him in and made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table and she said, "Tell me what it means for the tree," he told her. It took a while. He was careful about it, giving her the room to ask questions without implying she should ask them, not filling silences that didn't need filling. She asked 3 questions. He answered each one directly. She did not ask a 4th because she didn't need to. When he stood to go, she said, "What would a partnership look like for the rest of the orchard?" He said the research program would want to document all 12 varieties. He offered this quietly, without pressing, the way you offer something when you do not know how it will land and are prepared to accept either answer. She told him she'd think about it. She thought about it for 3 days, the kind of thinking that requires cold air and movement, and the specific quality of silence that comes off a bare orchard in November. She walked the rows each morning before first light, the frost holding hard under her boots. She walked from the south fence to the north, and each morning when she reached the North Row, she stopped at the old tree and put her hand against the bark the way he used to put his hand on things he was deciding something about. Just for a moment, the bark was cold and furrowed, and exactly as it had always been. She walked back each time through the same rows. She did not arrive at the answer by walking. The answer was already there, had been there for 7 years, had been there before the letter, and before Adair, and before all the men who had come to her kitchen table with figures and careful language. She arrived at it by recognizing it, which was a different thing. On the 4th morning she rose before 5, dressed in the dark, did not light the lamp. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window as the sky over the ridge went from black to the first thin gray. The knife was on the sill in front of her. Birch handle, 1998, scratched into the wood with a finishing nail, the weight and grain of it familiar the way only the things your hands have handled for years are familiar. He had scratched the year into the handle because the marking was the thing. He had walked the slope in the rain watching where the water chose to go. He had driven across 2 provinces to bring back a dormant scion from a nursery in the Qu'Appelle Valley because he had read something in a catalog and believed it was worth the drive. He had not known, and she had not known, and no one had known what was growing in the North Row. He had simply brought the tree home and planted it in the ground he had chosen with care, and it had grown, and it had kept growing through 7 springs without him, and it was still there. She picked up the knife. She held it, the cold from the window glass in the handle, the shape of it fitting her grip the way it always had. Then she set it back down on the sill. She unlocked the door and stepped outside. He was on the top step, his back to the door, coffee in both hands, looking out at the dark rows. He moved slightly to his left without turning around, making room. She sat beside him and pulled her coat closed at the collar. Neither of them spoke. The cold was the kind that had come in off the prairie overnight and settled in for the season. The ridge above the orchard was still dark. The sky behind it was going lighter in the way it went lighter in November, slowly, cautiously, as though testing whether the dark was done. A crow called once from the south row, and then the orchard was quiet. She said, "I'm not selling." He nodded. He drank his coffee. He did not say anything else. The light came the way it came in November. All at once after taking its time, the ridge going from dark to copper, and then the light dropping into the valley, laying itself along the rows, one at a time, south to north. She watched it reach the north row. She watched it find the old tree. The orchard was the same orchard it had been in the dark. The same rows curving the way the water wanted to go, the same 11 varieties and one that no one had expected to still be in the world. She had not known, in 7 years of walking this ground, what was in it. She had kept it because she could not have done otherwise. The keeping had turned out to mean something she had not planned for. That was not a lesson. That was just how it had gone. She stayed on the step until the light was full in the valley. Then she went inside. The knife was on the windowsill where she had left it. She left it there.